Hey guys, Chad Hoover. Welcome to today's video where I'm going to talk to you about fishing with spinning rods and a few things that you definitely need to keep in mind. All right guys, so before we get started, today's video is brought to you by Fish USA. You can find this Lose Reel, this All Pro rod, this Cortland line, this Seaguar leader, this Z-Man lure, and the Z-Man head. This is the TRD crawl. Pretty much that and everything else in the fishing universe from the folks at Fish USA at America's Tackle. Actually, you can even find these sunglasses so that I can see at Fish USA. So do me a favor, head down to the description box, head over to Fish USA, sign up for their newsletter. Be sure to stay up to speed on all their great offers. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about fishing a spinning rod. And I know you're saying to yourself, like, how do you fish a spinning rod right or wrong? So we're going to talk about that. One of the number one frustrations that I see people having with spinning rods is wind knots. And I also see people fishing spinning rods wrong, which causes more wind knots, and it causes a lot of situations where you make a presentation that doesn't result in as many bites or bites that you don't feel. It adds to the frustration of getting wind knots. So I'm going to take you over here to the water and kind of walk you through some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to fishing a spinning rod. All right, so when it comes to casting a fishing rod, you want to load the rod to throw the lure. You don't want to sling the lure. Here's the difference. This is slinging the lure. I see that a lot, okay? Slinging the lure doesn't take advantage of the physics associated with a graphite rod, a fiberglass rod, or any rod made of even semi-premium materials. All you're doing is you're using the weight of the lure, you're opening up the bail, and you're slinging the lure. And I see this happen quite a bit. There's a couple of problems with that. In kayak fishing, one of the biggest problems is when you sling it, you create this big rock in your boat, which creates this wobble, which sends a pressure wave out, and in shallow water, that alerts the fish that you were there, and in a lot of cases, it spooks fish. So if you've ever made a cast and slung the lure, and you've spooked a fish, that's part of the reason. Secondly, it calls for a lot more movement. By and large, what you want to do to cast a spinning rod is you want to get out about 1.5 to 2 foot of line. You want to grab the line with your finger, open the bail. That puts you in the ready to cast position. What I like to do is press my finger against the foregrip or against the blank, simply make a snap cast, and you want to let go of it at the perfect time. If you notice right there, if I hold on too hard, I let go of the lure late, it hits right in front of me. If you let go too late, which I call the rainbow cast, in a lot of cases your lure goes way up in the air, and when it lands, you've got this big arch in your line. By the time you reel up the slack, two things have happened. You've reeled up a lot of slack into your reel, which causes or complicates or compounds the problem with wind knots, or the lure has hit the water, the fish has already hit it and spit it, and you don't even feel it. So what you want to do is you want to split the difference. I like to tell people you want to cast like a football quarterback pass. You don't want to throw it straight up in the air like a Hail Mary. You don't want to throw it at the ground like you're trying to pull an intentional grounding foul or penalty. You want to kind of split the difference. I like to go either over my shoulder straight, or a lot of times what I like to do is come crossbody. That makes me a little bit more accurate with a spinning rod. You want to get that line on the tip of your finger, not hold it against the blank. That causes a late release. You just want to rear back and snap it out there. Then I like to close the bail and let off, or close the bail or let off a line's worth of, a rod length's worth of line as the lure's hitting the water. If I let it fly out too much, and especially if the wind's going, I get this big belly in my line. The first thing you want to do is lay the line on the water. That allows you to watch the lure fall to the bottom by the line that it's pulling down. And if a fish hits it or starts moving, you detect it and you can reel down and set the hook, okay? So let's go through that one more time. You don't want to throw this thing like a rainbow, and you don't want to sling it to the ground like you're trying to intentionally ground a football. You want to split the difference, but what you want to do is you want to go back and load that rod so that the rod bends back and then snaps the lure. And you want to make a cast about like a laser beam. Ideally, what I like to do is pretend like I got a donut on my thumb and like I'm throwing the donut at the spot. And what you want to do is you want to follow the lure to the water. There's a reason for following the lure to the water. What causes you to reduce casting distance, which is what happens with casting rods a lot of time, is the guide friction of the line across the guide increases the friction, slows down the amount of line that the lure is able to pull out, shortens your casting distance, okay? So that happens a lot, and that's what causes backlashes by and large in casting reel fishing. We'll talk more about that when we take a deeper look at fishing a casting rod. But in today's video, what I'm talking about is fishing a spinning reel. There's two things I want you to take away from this. Get away from the rainbow cast, okay? Get away from the arm sling cast. I can cast pretty much as far as anybody else out there that does the whew and throws it as hard as they can by proper casting technique, having a decent rod and the right amount of weight on the lure. Pop it out there. As it hits the water, lay your line on the water. That way you don't get a wind knot. Pull off a rod's worth of line, go back, and then bring your line in lure, in line. You want to line it up. You don't want to belly. That way when the fish hits it, you can see it. And then what I like to do is I move my lure with my rod, not my reel. So this is where we get into fishing with a spinning rod. You want to bump that lure along the bottom, and then you want to lay the line down, watch it for a second, okay? This is really one of those things that differentiate guys that catch a lot of fish from the guys that catch a few fish, these little things. So one of them is to move that lure, let it settle back in the position you want it, and then lay that line on the water. Just lay it on the water, and then watch for that line to move in that direction. That's one of the reasons I like to go from a leader to braided line. That knot acts like a strike indicator in fly fishing. And you want to simply move that lure with the rod. You never want to get past 12 o'clock. If you get back here and the fish hits it, you've got a long ways to go to catch up, and you got no leverage if you do set the hook immediately. If you stay out here about 11 o'clock down to 0, you've always got room to set the hook and catch up to the fish, and you've always got room to give them line. So again, if you see that fish hit it, see that line jump, give them a little bit of line, watch the direction it's moving. Here's where you get the difference between a fisherman and an angler. Anglers play angles, fishermen just go fishing. So if you see that line moving to the right, reel down and set the hook to the left. When you do that, by and large, you're gonna get a hook set on the right corner of the mouth. If the fish is swimming to the left and you hook to the right, you're gonna get a hook set in the left corner of the mouth. It's just physics. The line is going into that side, it's gonna run out and hook that hook right into the corner of the mouth. Hooks into the corner of the mouth are, for the most part, about the most effective, deadly, not deadly in that it's gonna catch the fish. It's not gonna hurt the fish. It's in a good spot, it gets a good purchase, and you have control of the fish because you can put pressure on them. Angles, right? The difference between an angler and a fisherman is a fisherman fishes, an angler angles. You change angles and you put pressure on that fish. The other thing that happens is that if you get too far behind you with a spinning rod and a fish jumps and the rod unloads, so this is a loaded rod, and the fish jumps, you've got a shock absorber in there. If you get way back here and the fish jumps and the rod straightens out, you don't have any shock absorber. The weight of the lure is gonna help that fish shake its head, and the weight of the lure helps the fish throw it. So let's run through it one more time. You wanna make a snap cast for one, not an arm sling cast, and you don't wanna sling the lure, you wanna cast it. Donut on your finger like you're throwing it into a bucket, okay? Let the lure hit the bottom, lay the line on the water, reel up your slack, off of the water, not out of the air. And here's why that is. If you ever have slack in a spinning reel, especially when you make one of those big rainbow casts and you reel up the slack, that's what causes the wind knots in the spool. If, for the most part, you keep friction on the line, on the water, you'll almost never reel up a wind knot. The way that you get rid of wind knots is real simple, especially in a kayak. This is an easy way to do it, no matter if you fish from a boat or a kayak. But from a kayak, it's real simple. Hold your rod out horizontal and watch that bait. That bait is going to unspin. It had a little bit of a spin in it there. I stop every 4, 5, 6 casts, let my lure hang off about 2 rods length, or I cast it out behind me and reel it back in real slow, and for the most part, it takes out the spin. If I get a wind knot, before I sit there and fight it, okay, before I ever sit there and fight it, I bring my lure up, I cut it off with my line cutter, I take my line, I stick it on the water, I open my bail and I start paddling. That pulls off about 100 yards worth of line, and then I turn around with my rod tip in the water and I reel that line back to me. That friction of that line in the water causes it to unspin, gets rid of the spin, and it keeps me from getting wind knots in the future. If I ever get it in the first place, that's the key. Once you get it so spun up that it's coiling up every time your lure hits the water and you get those wind knots, that's when you need to stop. You can take your lure and hold it out, and if that gets rid of it, great. But if that doesn't get rid of it and it's down in your spool, just open your bail, take your lure off, or go to a lure like a fluke that's got lightweight or Senko, throw it out behind you and paddle about 15, 20 yards. That's going to unspin that line. It's going to straighten it out, and you're good for another couple of weeks. Don't fish baits that spin on a spinning reel because it's going to compound the problem. Now, I'll do a more in-depth review of this down the road when I do the deeper look on how to spool a casting reel, but let me break it down for you real simple. Tie your basic knot, come through your first guide, go to your spool. Reel your spool, line on your spool until you get about 15 or 20 wraps, and then lower your rod down and put some slack in the line. If there's a coil, flip the spool over and then start reeling again. Do that back and forth so that you don't twist your line going onto your spool, and for the most part, that'll eliminate you ever having problems once you get out on the water. Again, I'll do a more in-depth video and a deeper look at spooling a spinning reel, but the simple concept is don't hold the spinning line, spool in line like you do with a casting reel. Lay it flat, reel the line on there, lower it down about every 10 or 15 winds. Make sure that it's not twisting. If it is, just flip the spool over and start reeling again, and you're basically counteracting that twist, and you're taking that twist off as you're putting the line on the reel. The next thing you want to do is make sure you don't get any closer than 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the spool. If you get too close to the edge of the spool, those loops fall off too easy and you end up with wind knots that way. So if you can avoid that, don't overfill your spool, flip your spool back and forth as you're winding it. If you start to get any twist, throw your line out and reel it in real slow. You can go out in the yard and do the same thing and you'll get rid of a lot of it. I've heard people throwing it up over a tree limb and letting it hang and all the line will spin out. Obviously, you can't do that on the water. The easiest thing for me, bite the lure off, open the bail, whip off a little bit of line, get some line friction on the water, paddle away, pull off 100 yards worth of line, reel it back in and retie. It's simple. It takes a few minutes, but avoids a ton of frustration getting a knotted up spool on your casting reel. But if you can keep in mind that you're gonna load the rod and cast, not sling it, it's gonna make you stealthier and you're gonna be more accurate and you're gonna be more consistent with your cast. Secondly, you're not gonna have this big arch in your line when it hits so that you create all this extra slack and you end up with more wind knots. You're gonna be more in contact with your lures when it comes to setting the hook when a fish initially hits, or at least detecting that it's there, reeling down, getting your slack out, waiting, setting a hook in that opposite direction. Again, talking about an angler versus a fisherman. And then more importantly, you wanna balance your reel. You want the reel that is the right weight to the right rod. And so for the most part for me, it's 1,500 to 2,500 for anything 6'6" to 7 foot. Anything over 7 foot, I'll go 2,500 to 3,000, and I very rarely ever go any bigger than that. It's really more about line capacity than it is real size. It's more about drag. If I'm fishing some really big fish, I'll go to that 3,500 series. For the most part for me, it's a 1,500 series. This speed spool from Lew's, again, in some of my other videos, I've talked about value. I don't fish spinning reels as much, so therefore I don't spend as much. I save my money and spend it on my casting reels. But this is a great spinning reel. It's a tournament series. This is the tournament T200. Again, the 200 size, 100, 200, 300. Some series is 1,000, 1,200, 1,300, 1,500. Some are 1,500, 2,500, 3,000. Again, that middle size for me, that 200 or that 1,500 size is ideal. Balances well. It's not super heavy. It's not a bigger spool and weighting the rod down, and it allows that rod to be way more sensitive because it's well balanced, right? You don't want that rod to, when you hold it in your hand, you don't want it to just tip over, right? So if you hold it and it's got a nice feel to it and you can put your finger on there and it balances nicely, you get a lot more sensitivity out of it. If it just falls over in your hand, it's way too heavy. Downsize your reel. Guys, that's it. Avoiding wind knots, fishing a spinning rod more effectively. If you remember back in my other video, and if you haven't seen it yet, check out the link in the description box. You're gonna fish a spinning rod for things that have slack in the line or slow presentation. Slack in the line or slow presentations. I'm not a big fan of fishing a topwater, a spinner bait, or a crankbait. I don't even like fishing jerk baits on spinning rods. I do it from time to time if the water's really cold, but for the most part for me, slow or slack. Now that jerk bait falls into that category because I do snap, snap, slack, so it works. We'll get way more into that in a future deeper look at fishing jerk baits. That's not today's video, but I do appreciate you tuning into today's video. Do me a favor, head down to the description box, visit the website, check out fishusa.com. We couldn't make these videos possible if it wasn't for those guys. There's some links to their newsletter. There's some subscriber links down there that help me help you by generating some revenue for the channel. Again, it's one of those things that If you want to support the channel and you want to help us bring you better content, you know, use those links to make your purchases. It helps us out, offset the cost of creating this content. It gets you a great deal, and it puts you in touch with the best tackle shop on the planet, America's Tackle Shop, Fish USA. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Do me a favor, leave me a comment in the comment section. Smash that thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to turn on the notifications so I can help you guys get in the know about catching more bass.